The 1860 election is one of the most pivotal in U.S. history, the country tearing itself apart over the slavery question. Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln would narrowly come out on top, stoking fears among the Southern gentry that would lead them to secession and eventually civil war. Over the course of the conflict, Lincoln would shift goals from preserving the Union and sovereignty over the New World toward the abolition of slavery. While the freedom of African Americans would remain greatly restricted throughout the next century, the nation would take a crucial step towards freedom for all and genuine equality. Which of course begs the question, what if it didn't? What if Lincoln lost the 1860 election? Now, this election is actually very difficult for Lincoln to lose. By this point, the Democratic Party was tearing itself apart over the slavery question, just like the Whigs had done, and were divided as a result. The quote-unquote main ticket was headed by Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, but the Southern delegates walked out of the convention and ran a splinter under John Breckenridge, who won 11 states to Douglas's singular Missouri. Even if we say that Douglas is able to keep the party together and run with Breckenridge, it wouldn't swing the election. The division only messed with 5 states, the slave states of Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee, and the free states of Oregon and California. Which, we'll admit, some part of me wants to defend the West Coast on that, on the basis of free trade, and Breckenridge picked a VP from Oregon, but then I remember the state banned black people. And yeah, no, that's bad. That is bad. And the slave states actually went to a third party, the Constitutional Union Party, under John Bell, which kind of just said everyone sucked. But the question is, how does Lincoln lose if we can't just put the Democrats back together? Well, we have to go a little further. See, this was not the first time that Lincoln and Douglas had gone up against each other. Both of them ran for an Illinois Senate seat in 1858, with their debates bringing them to national prominence. Douglas would win the race, but a few questions proved detrimental to his reputation as a moderate with the South. Namely, the Freeport Doctrine, wherein Lincoln challenged Douglas to pick between the detested Dred Scott case and his ideals of popular sovereignty. Basically, the idea that the citizens of protective states should be the ones to actually decide whether or not you could own people there. In contrast, Dred Scott said that free states couldn't restrict the travel of slave owners with people in bondage. Naturally, rather unpopular with the northern states in the Midwest and New England. Douglas attempted to take a third option, but all it really did was alienate him from everyone in a few years. Now, even if Douglas avoids the problem and manages to win Illinois, the Democrats are still so unpopular that this doesn't actually matter, so we have to go even deeper. This is Hannibal Hamlin, Lincoln's VP in 1860. Hamlin was vital to balancing the ticket between the regions of the North, the Midwestern moderate paired with Hamlin's New England radicalism. You know, something about black people actually being free and equal versus not just making more of them slaves. In addition, Hamlin was a former Democrat, vital to winning support among the disaffected anti-slavery faction. So let's replace Hammy with former Missouri Representative Edward Bates from the border regions. This would be to show that the Lincoln ticket was moderate and would actually negotiate with the South in the event of a win. However, they wouldn't win Lincoln much support and would cost him support in New England. Now, realistically, even in this scenario, Lincoln wins. He won most New England states by over 60% of the vote, with a shout-out to New Hampshire where he cleared 70. The most populated parts of the country were, at this point, done with the Democrats and done with slavery. This map, which I made with 270 to win, is probably the absolute worst case for Lincoln even in this scenario. And as you can see, the Democrats barely pull off a win under Douglas. So what happens now? Especially as it seems slave power has stolen the election, Northern secession would feel like throwing in the towel. So expect lots of violence, especially in the border states of Kentucky and Missouri. But their representatives will be demanding reform and concession, not secession, yet. But what does the Stephen Douglas administration look like? In a word, bad. Despite barely managing to keep the party united in the election, the Little Giant is going to be fighting a highly divided party to pass any legislation, and that's if the Democrats win a majority. Instead, it would largely be North versus South at this point, at least in the legislation. The absolute most he could do would be Nevada and New Mexico being admitted as free and slave states respectively, but the South wouldn't be able to abide getting the North getting a free state at this point, and there were hardly any slaves in the New Mexico territory, so it would be more like a double free state. In addition, even if he narrowly won, Douglas wouldn't be popular with anyone by the midterms. The North isn't going to like the slave power he's associated with, and the South will distrust his Northern heritage more and more after becoming disaffected by his compromises failing to be pro-Dixie. So, what happens? I think he gets assassinated. Not by John Wilkes Booth, but by some other radical pro-Southerner. And thus ascends John Breckenridge. Well, at this point, there would be some conventions in the North over secession. I don't think they'd work out. Secession just doesn't capture the zeitgeist of the more centralized and urban North like it did the South that was reflexively anti-federalist. But what does the Breckenridge administration look like? Well, frankly, I think he's just going to be a lame duck, and that's all he's going to be able to do is prepare the South for the inevitable war. The Northern Democrats would have, at this point, abandoned the party, either joining up with the Republicans or just broken off and called themselves the True Democrats. In addition, the Douglas-Breckenridge term will have one major consequence. I think that Virginia will see a surge in Unionist ideals. The Republicans put out a compromise ticket. They weren't abolitionists. Then a Southerner killed a Northern Democrat who was trying to compromise with them. That's going to show the moderates that the South is the unreasonable party, not the North. And Virginia's secession convention was incredibly close in real life. It actually started with majority Unionists, but about half of the... Now, what happens in 1864? Well, it's going to look a lot like our 1860. The Democrats will be split, with the North and South running different tickets. Breckenridge wouldn't even attempt to appeal to the Northern wing anymore, openly running a dual Southern ticket of himself and Jefferson Davis, while the North would run someone like George Bancroft. Bell probably runs under the Constitutional Union Party again. The real question is who the Republicans run. And to that I say, they run Lincoln again. The man barely lost 1860, and by any reasonable metric he would have won it. Like I said, the only reason Douglas won is me fudging the numbers on the scenario. The 1864 election in this world is Breckenridge easily sweeps the South, Bancroft and Bell fighting in the border states, and Lincoln sweeps the North with literally any New England VP. So what? Does history just play out the same as in our world? I say no, because the South does lose Virginia to the Union, and at best, Richmond pushes to be allowed to be neutral. What does that mean? It means that the South doesn't have its most populated state, its industry, already half of the Unions, is now gutted, their best officers now either fighting for the Union or being out of command entirely. That being said, this is still George McClellan at the helm of the army. I don't think Lee would actually be willing to fight for the Union at this point, even if Virginia is loyal. Everything is too radicalized, and the moderates have been pushed out of almost every state. The South probably still holds until 1863, since the Union does still have to advance all the way to Montgomery, Alabama, while having the same issues it had in real life. Plus, between Buchanan and Breckenridge, the place is going to be stacked with arms and ammunition to make the war as hard as possible for the North. Now, interestingly, much like Virginia, Tennessee had its own faction that wanted to become its own state, this time East Tennessee. Shocking, I know. Now, in real life, this was struck down by the Tennessee state legislature because, of course it was, no state's ever going to be, okay with that. But here, even if Virginia remains wholly Unionist, I think East Tennessee would have a shot, especially if its supporters are able to go through the West Virginia method of declaring themselves legitimate government of the state and just seceding that way. Could be fun. For the sake of argument, we'll call them Franklin, put the border around the eastern third of the state. Now, despite the fact that Lincoln was a moderate and the war would be over faster, I do think slavery would end. The Emancipation Proclamation would absolutely still be necessary to keep certain vagabond empires from getting any funny ideas, and the 13th Amendment would be essential to keeping the Republican Party united. The 14th Amendment, while morally good, also just makes sense to ensure that the reforms stick. However, I don't think that Lincoln is going to sway that heavily from his original Reconstruction plans. He would pardon most Southerners, bar high-ranking officials and officers, admit the states back to the Union after 10% of the voting population took loyalty oaths, and had no designs on the property of the aristocracy, at least other than slaves. Even if Southern states were forced to educate former slaves, this will largely play out very similar to our Reconstruction, at least from the 1864 to 1868 term. If you're liking the video so far, please do consider subscribing. It would really help my channel grow, and I want as many people along for the wild ride as possible. But let's back out from the US for a little bit. because delaying the Civil War does have implications for the wider world. Firstly, Napoleon III probably isn't able to take over Mexico. He absolutely still invades, since the pretext for the invasion was debt collection and he was in a coalition with Britain and Spain, but he doesn't attempt to impose Maximilian of Austria in 1862, since the US isn't in a civil war. Do I think that Douglas would be able to do much about it if they tried? Not really, but the rising power of the US was absolutely enough of a deterrent that they wouldn't. They might get some serious economic concessions out of the country, maybe enough to even look like a protectorate, but it won't be an actual regime change. So good job, Douglas. I think that alone puts you above James Buchanan. That being said, you were also above Buchanan by default, so, grain of salt. Breckenridge wouldn't care about the Union standing at this point, but he probably would want his Confederacy to conquer Mexico itself, so he's not going to be happy about France's ideas either. Now, that has implications for France and Mexico. Firstly, Juarez actually has to deal with elections in 1865, but it's hard to say how these go. During the revolt against the empire, he concentrated a lot of political power in himself and caused a constitutional crisis when he refused to step down to the Supreme Court. Later, his re-elections would be mired in accusations of voter fraud. It doesn't seem unlikely that he tries these stunts even without France's invasion, but it could also be that he steps down. He can't claim to be a war hero this time around, and he did come to power on a revolution. That cycle could easily repeat, and I like to think that he does lose and accept the results, helping stabilize Mexico, but it does seem uncertain. In France, the failure is a short-term problem for Napoleon III, but in the long term gives him more time and money to modernize his army, which means it would perform better against Prussia. Interestingly, I could see Napoleon III pushing the Luxembourg crisis a little earlier to look good, which would mean attempts to take over Luxembourg and Belgium. Now, unless he manages to time this to just right before the Austro-Prussian War, I don't think this would work for him either, but theoretically it could happen. The big thing is that France comes out of the war either without territorial losses or only losing recent conquests. That being said, I do think that Germany taking Luxembourg might be strategically worse for France than Germany taking Alsace. So in real life, Spain actually took command of the Dominican Republic again when the country asked to be annexed in 1861. This probably goes through in this timeline as well, but it's immediately much more unstable. The lack of resistance was more due to lack of weapons than lack of willpower. Even if Douglas is dead by this point and Breckenridge is uninterested or cynical, the lack of a civil war will mean that American arms dealers will make a killing supplying weapons and making it difficult for Spain to hold Hispaniola. And after the war, Lincoln would send even more, similar to what he and Johnson did in Mexico. Now, let's zoom back into the US. What's their political scene look like by 1868? Well, once Lincoln's had his 2 terms, the party would be rather annoyed with his very moderate stances. Most of the states would be readmitted by this point, meaning that there's no army occupying them to force equality. So this is when the radicals would come to power. Under who, I can't really say. Maybe it's Grant, maybe not. It's under this president that the 15th Amendment passes, and the country likely tightens whatever leash it can on ex-Confederates, but I don't think there will be Union soldiers in the South after Lincoln's full term. The Democratic Party would likely have collapsed by this point, at least in the North. They'd be tainted with the war and the fact that their last 3 presidents have been utter failures, and an open traitor. I suspect that the 1866 and 1868 elections would be contests between the Republicans and Constitutional Unionists, or some generic conservative party. I doubt that the Republicans have even a decade in the South of this timeline, which means they'll become lily white and racially moderate after the 1872 election, which is rather unfortunate. In the South, the Democrats remain relevant, the Republicans shooting themselves in the foot. I think it's very much a solid South, at least for a while. Constitutional Unionists are probably the main opposition down here too, funnily enough. I think that this party system would actually be very ripe to be exploited by some sort of populist labor movement in the 1870s, but at this point it becomes extremely unpredictable what politics look like in the US. Mexico, France, or really even Germany are not much better on this. Between the US's unpredictable partisan situation, though I'm leaning towards Republicans v. Socialists, Mexico's restored republic being butterflied at the source, and the political fallout of the Franco-Prussian War being entirely altered, we've completely butterflied everything about the mid-19th century. So I'm going to have to call this scenario done. If you liked the video and potentially want to see a part 2, please do subscribe to the channel and have a great day.